Bonjour tout le monde, and welcome back to my Fire Emblem 3 Houses 100% completion tier list. Please go and watch part 1 now if you haven't done so already, because this video will probably be pretty confusing otherwise. Today I'll be covering all the students of the main 3 houses, aside from the house leaders. That's a lot of characters to place in one sitting, so let's get right into it, beginning with the Black Eagles. And first off, it's just more of the same. Hubert's going right down in D tier with his lady, because he's locked to Crimson Flower, which means he's got the same issue of extremely limited availability that she does. It's actually a little worse for him, because while Edelgard is absent from the story maps of chapters 6 and 11 while she's off being the Flame Emperor, Hubert is missing for the entire calendar month of chapter 11, because he's busy sneaking an army into Garreg Mach and also murdering his father in cold blood. Hubert, I love your hammy villainy, but that's no excuse for skipping class. Even leaving that aside though, Hubert fares worse overall than Edelgard, with a lower net proficiency, a mostly unhelpful set of boons, and the worst possible bane a male character can have, flying. At least he can double up on 2 of his banes in the Wyvern classes, and like Edelgard, he's also got classroom training and Silver Snow runs to help him out. His budding talent in lances also offers a small perk in the form of Frozen Lance, a very powerful magic combat art that can give him some better damage in lance classes before he's built up his strength. This is noteworthy because I don't consider magic weapons reliable ways to build up weapon ranks with magically inclined characters, not when you can't buy the ore to forge and repair them until chapter 16 at the earliest, and this goes double for lance rank as the Arrow of Indra is vastly harder to come by than the other magic weapons. It's better just to push through their low strength with class certification bonuses and stat boosters until these characters can wield forged silver weapons. On that note, Hubert's most valuable boon, oddly enough, is the one no one considers when thinking of him, his boon in bows. I have a theory that because 3 houses got rid of daggers as a weapon type, it gave assassin-type characters like Hubert and Shamir boons and bows as a way of making up for it. Either way, Hubert will have to leverage every advantage he can get to work around his awful root lock, but if nothing else, he can be confident that he's not quite the worst root lock character in the game, or even in his own root. Nope, not getting into that right now. Instead, let's talk about the fabulous Ferdinand von Aegir. And looking at his skill spread, it's easy to see that he's very fabulous indeed. Ferdinand not only comes with no banes, but also takes the prize for the highest net proficiency in the game at 5, which is even better than Byleth. You could say though that number is more quantity than quality, and it's true that of those 5 boons, only his budding talent and heavy armor matters all that much. But at the same time, a character who'll be working with at least one of his boons in over half the game's classes and never has to work through a bane will be much easier to max out than many of his peers. Ferdinand therefore will be our first A tier, a tier reserved for characters with high availability who further distinguish themselves in some other notable way. That's Ferdinand all over. Oh, and by the way, if you were wondering, the easiest way to handle cross-house recruitment in New Game Plus is to buy supports with Renown. Doing so is actually quite cheap compared to most other important purchases in the journal, with it only costing 1200 Renown to buy each character's A support, which will ensure that you can recruit them without any additional requirements. This is why I'm not talking about the stats or skill ranks needed to do cross-house recruitment normally, because you can sidestep all that hassle quite easily in New Game Plus. For the purposes of this tier list, I assume that you do this with all of the non-root lock students every run after you get their Byleth supports, and recruit them in Chapter 2 so they have the maximum amount of time to train in the classroom or even in your active army if so desired. Next up is Linhardt, and compared to Ferdinand, he's much more what I'd call a typical student character. Having the same number of boons and banes is obviously far from ideal, and as much as I can appreciate Linhardt as the closest thing to a pure mage in this game, his total lack of physical weapon boons does not help his long-term growth. Yes, he's got Warp, and Warp is just as amazing in normal mode as it is everywhere else, but with both Reason and Faith boons, he'll quickly max out all his magic classes and be stuck staring down around 24 physical classes, where his performance will be average at best. He can't very well warp anybody when he's stuck in the bondage gear of a grappler, can he? Linhardt's going firmly in B tier, the just above average home for most of the student characters. His physically focused friend and counterpart Caspar mirrors him when it comes to skills, albeit imperfectly. Caspar is the first of 3 characters with a negative net proficiency. In other words, he's got more banes than boons. The added Authority Bane is a nuisance, but what hurts him even more is that, as I said, Caspar isn't Linhardt's exact opposite. Instead of a Faith Bane, he's got one in bows, and oddly enough, that's a worse deal for him. Not just because there are fewer bow classes than Faith classes, but also because it means that Caspar will be dealing with his Banes in some of his physical classes in addition to his predictably terrible performance when it comes to magic. Oh yeah, and Caspar's got one of the worst spell lists in the game, in both Reason and Faith. So while Linhardt can eventually smash through his targets with forged silver weapons, Caspar's stuck throwing out some very pathetic fires and bolganones. For physically oriented characters with horrible spell lists, I strongly recommend training them primarily as adjutants when it comes to their magic classes. Except wait, Caspar's Authority Bane means it'll take him longer to get to regular backliner status. Wonderful. He goes below Linhardt, no question. We're unfortunately not done with negative net proficiencies either. Check out Bernadetta and her extremely min-max skill ranks. She really wants to be a bow knight, and that's about it. With all but a handful of other physical class options she has, held back by one or more of her many Banes. Bernadetta possesses one of the game's only permanent sword Banes, which is more mildly interesting trivia than an actual problem when there are so many sword classes, but what are actual problems are her Banes in brawling and heavy armor. A heavy armor Bane is a hard one to manage for any character, but a brawling Bane on a female character is worth dropping a position or two on the tier list all on its own. When it comes to brawling classes for women, it really is just War Cleric, which means that unless they want to spend the last third or so of a run grinding out a single rank in one slightly above average class, they'll be doing most of their brawling training in the classroom, and a brawling Bane makes that prospect just that much worse. Bernadetta is less hobbled when it comes to magic, and even though she's got an awful magic growth and nothing pointing her in that direction, her spell lists are both incredibly solid, with gems like Thoron, Thimblevetter, and Rescue. If nothing else, this offers an opportunity to excel at something other than the Cavalier and Archer lines, and she is really good in the Archer role thanks to her learning Deadeye, which gives her even more range than the Universal Combat Art Curve Shot. But none of that is saving her from going below Caspar. Those Banes are just atrocious. But let's finish off the Eagles on a pair of higher notes. Dorothea at first glance looks a bit like a slightly better Linhardt. She's got the paired magic boons, along with some really solid spells like Thoron and Meteor, along with an only slightly more favorable physical outlook countered by total aversion to mounted classes. Fun fact, Dorothea is the only female character with a flying Bane, although of course that's nowhere near as bad on her as it is on male characters. I will say though that apart from that excellent reason list, Dorothea is a bit of a letdown. It's a shame she doesn't get anything out of her budding talent and faith but an avoid boost that only applies to Nosferatu. And the only non-generic faith spell she gets is Physic, which is, sure, a good spell, but there's only so much you can do with it. The sword boon is similarly underwhelming, as sword boons often are, but especially in her case when her strength growth is as low as Bernadetta's magic, and when she only learns Hexblade, which is the weaker of the two magic sword combat arts. I think she still deserves a place over Linhardt for her net proficiency alone, and for having both her Banes be in movement-type skills attached to a variety of class options. I just wish there were a little more to her. But Canon Dancer, you know. Dancers always rank high on the basis of their unique utility, and even if Dorothea is far from the only character in Three Houses who can provide that utility, it's clearly the role she's built to perform. Petra, meanwhile, is considerably more diverse, at least on the physical end. She's a bit like Ferdinand in that regard. Unlike Ferdinand, however, Petra's got Banes, and between the two of them and a set of bottom-tier spell lists, it's obvious where her problem areas lie. Props to her for helping me illustrate my overall tiering philosophy, though, as I'll be placing her just under Dorothea. Petra may have a higher net proficiency and more classes where she'll excel, and her boon in bows is the only really strong one either character has, but she'll struggle considerably more with her reason and faith ranks and associated classes than Dorothea will with the mounted ranks. A useful trait the movement type skills have is that they can be worked on simultaneously with a weapon or magic rank, while conversely there are only a handful of classes that allow Petra to double up like that while using her Banes. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Petra is the worst magic user in the game, if only because I could never give that label to a female character when they have a much better set of gender-exclusive magic classes than males do. but she's definitely near the bottom in that regard. Moving right along to the Blue Lions, let's hop back down to D tier for a minute and get Azure Moon's second root lock character squared away. Just as Hubert is to Edelgard, so is Dedue to Dimitri, right next to and beneath his beloved prince. Also like with Hubert, Dedue's got a bigger availability problem as well, as he disappears after the time skip and doesn't return until Chapter 16's story map, causing him to miss out on 3 whole calendar months worth of growth. In normal mode, he won't struggle with being underleveled relative to the enemies when he comes back, but that's a fair amount of training time he has no way of getting back. It of course goes without saying that you should always complete Dedue's paralog so that he comes back at all, even if you're just training him in the classroom for that particular run. I'm still not done with the Hubert comparisons, however, because compared to Dimitri, Dedue also comes with the same issue of having more Banes and thus a lower net proficiency than his house leader. He and Hubert even share their terrible flying and faith Banes. At least Dedue's saving graces in terms of skill ranks are more in line with how you'd expect to use him, namely heavy armor and brawling. Do yourself a favor and make him an adjutant when it comes time to put him through his magic classes. There's just no saving a 15% magic growth, I'm afraid. Still, unlike the writing of Azure Moon, I know better than to try to separate Dimitri and Dedue, and the two of them can comfortably share the time and resources available to them in their route in spite of some minor hiccups in availability. Next up is the Lion's Contrarian number 3, or Dimitri's other boyfriend, if you will. Felix's reputation as a strong gameplay unit precedes him, and for the most part it bears out in 100% as well. He comes with 2 Banes, but he'll get rid of one of them via budding talent, leaving him only with an Authority Bane. And an Authority Bane by itself on a character with such high availability is scarcely a Bane at all. Compared to the Eagle's primary sword fighter Petra, Felix has a similarly wide array of weapon boons, and better ones overall too, since even a male character gains more from a boon in brawling than one in axes. Moreover, in exchange for neutrality in all the movement types, Felix can boast that he's not totally inept when it comes to magic, although it's fairly well known that his budding talent and reason is something of a trap for new players to trick them into thinking that he's a good hybrid unit, or that Mortal Savant is a good class in standard gameplay. He's not, and it's not, and Felix's lackluster magic growth and spell list do let him down in that department, even if, again, he still fares better than Petra does. Interesting to note that Felix shares his minuscule reason list with Dimitri, symbolic of their bond, perhaps? In light of his diverse physical options and lack of any serious banes, there's no better place for Felix than above all the other B tiers. Now let's see if he can hold on to that position at the top. Ashe, of all characters, doesn't seem like he'd be one to offer much competition there. I have a friend whose favorite Three Houses character is Ashe, because he's into the whole good-natured twink thing, and he was disappointed to learn that Ashe is not regarded as a good unit by more serious players. Let's see if I can do a little better there, because while Ashe is by no means a top-tier character in 100%, he's also nowhere near in sight of the bottom either. He's a solidly average student character, which translates to him being a bit above average thanks to the generous availability most students enjoy that allows them plenty of time to make up for their shortcomings. In Ashe's case, that's obviously his magic, as he's got all the usual problems there. His trio of weapon boons is useful, although collectively not quite so much as Felix's, and like Bernadetta, he learns Deadeye, giving him unparalleled range as an archer. Just make sure to equip him with the ability hit plus 20 when you're doing that, or he's going to be missing at that range most of the time. Ashe does also have the slight quirk of defecting from your army in Silver Snow and Verdant Wind, forcing you to re-recruit him in Chapter 15, and so having him miss out on a few calendar months worth of growth. But I'm not holding that against him, as it's doubtful you'll want to use him as an active unit in those routes. I'm putting him below Felix but above Dorothea, since he's got the same net proficiency as Petra but struggles a bit less with his single bane than either she or Dorothea do with theirs. Last of the Lion's boys is Sylvain, and you'll note that each of the 3 non-exclusive male lions has just 1 bane each. Sylvain unfortunately got the short end of the stick there, because if you're only going to struggle in one area, it's better if that area can be stretched out over more than 3 or 4 classes. He does have one notable advantage over Felix, in that he can back up his budding talent and reason much better with not one but two solid spell lists. So of these three guys, he's got the best hybrid offense prospects by far. I think that alone is enough to place him above Ash, just barely, because when comparing magical performance, it often is less about quantity of classes and more about the quality of other parameters. If that doesn't do it for you though, I'm obligated to note that Sylvain is a free Crops House recruit when playing as female Byleth. That's not enough to nudge him up to A tier, because realistically it'll just save you 1200 renown buying his A support in a handful of runs, which isn't all that noteworthy. But it does solidify his place between Felix and Ash in spite of his obnoxious Bane. Speaking of obnoxious Banes, however, Mercedes is here to bring us back into the depths of negative net proficiency. In many ways, her skill ranks resemble Bernadetta's. They're the only two characters with permanent sword Banes, and they also share Banes in axes and heavy armor. Mercedes swaps out Bernadetta's Brawling Bane for one in lances, which is all around a great trade. And like Hubert, she's a magic user who can make use of a helpful budding talent in bows. I'm not going to pretend that Mercedes doesn't have a rough time relative to most other students, but compared to the other characters with negative net proficiency, she's less pigeonholed into a single role. Yeah, her personal ability and Fate spell list instantly peg her as a healer, but she ranks above Bernadetta solely for her lack of a Brawling Bane. Caspar is more arguable, but I'd give him the nod there for having fewer Banes overall. Having 4 of them is just abysmal no matter how you slice it. Annette, meanwhile, doesn't have that many Banes to contend with, but the 2 that she does have are handfuls all the same. Struggling with both bows and heavy armor is nearly as much of a headache as the brawling and heavy armor combo, but to Annette's credit, the boons that counterbalance them are a bit better than their abundance of classes might suggest. An authority boon on someone who's rarely force deployed is always handy, and she can back up her other boons with 2 solid spell lists and Lightning Axe to ease her into her strangely good performance in Axe classes. I had to think quite a bit about where to place Annette among the B tiers, and in the end I settled on above Linhardt but below Petra, reflecting both her lightly positive net proficiency that combines solid magical and physical performances with a pair of truly unfortunate Banes. She's just going to have to resign herself to the fact that she'll be spending a lot of time in the backline swapping between Great Knight and Bow Knight. Incidentally, I'm aware that characters like Annette and Ignatz are known among series players for their abilities as rally bots, but I should point out that rallies are not really necessary in normal mode, with its lower enemy stats encouraging more aggressive play, not to mention that 100% completion encourages using fewer active units at a time so as to maximize their development in each run. There are a handful of exceptions, but for most maps in normal, the tactic will be to rush forward with 3 to 5 units and
kill every last one of them!
Sorry, couldn't resist. But yeah, that kind of playstyle makes dedicated utility units like rally bots more effort than they're worth, and that's why I've been evaluating units like Annette on other merits. Now to finish up the Lions, and it's a strong finish with Ingrid, the Bane-free member of the house. The obvious comparison here is to Ferdinand, where she comes out looking a bit worse thanks to the lack of a budding talent and a preference for flying rather than heavy armor. Even so, Ingrid does enjoy one notable advantage over Ferdinand in the form of her magical performance, as her strength and magic growths are equal and her spell lists are both workable, more so than Ferdinand's are to be sure. Ingrid lands just beneath him in A tier, and while her performance lacks any really interesting frills, she'll never lag in any area either, which matches the lower effort required in A tier just fine. Finally, we come to the Golden Deer, beginning with Lorenz. Lorenz is like Bernadetta in a way, in that his boons are oriented around a specific masterclass, Dark Knight in this case. Unlike Bernadetta, however, Lorenz has nowhere near as many Banes, and the one he does have is much less crippling than it is on her. Male characters still don't have a ton of brawling classes, but once you've gotten accustomed to getting female characters to S+ using nothing but War Cleric and a bunch of classroom time, the prospect of having a full 3+3 brawling classes sounds downright luxurious. Lorenz doesn't really struggle in any area as a result, with balanced hybrid growths a little better than Ingrid's and functional if not exactly top tier spell lists on top of his all-around average physical performance. I want to put him up there with the B-tier Lions boys, since like them he's only got the one Bane, but his net proficiency is lower than Felix's and Sylvain's, and none of his boons are valuable to the same degree as Ash's bows, so I feel comfortable placing Lauren's beneath those three. He does incidentally also have the same issue with defecting in 2 routes that Ash does, but as I said earlier, I don't think that factors into their placements much, if at all. The easiest point of comparison when talking about Raphael is Caspar, as they share a pair of boons and a pair of banes, but Raphael's 3rd boon in heavy armor saves him from negative net proficiency and is just generally useful besides. Authority versus riding banes, on the other hand, is hard to judge, so let's just say they about even out. I do unfortunately have to remark that Raphael almost certainly has the worst magical performance of any character in the game, combining Dedue's bottom-of-the-barrel magic growth with Caspar's bottom-of-the-barrel spell list. At least unlike Caspar, he doesn't have an authority bane slowing him down from becoming an adjutant, where he can train his magic with the least amount of hassle. Unsurprisingly, Raphael goes above Caspar if only on account of the heavy armor boon. Linhardt versus Raphael is more arguable, but also a much more difficult comparison. But in the end, I think less is more here, and give the nod to Linhardt for having only 2 banes rather than 3. You wouldn't guess it from their characters or default classes, but Ignatz and Felix have a number of things in common. They share boons in swords and bows, as well as a budding talent in reason, although thankfully Ignatz's reason list is a little more robust than Felix's. Ignatz flips around Felix's 1 bane, which is as useful as ever on someone who's not a main character, but in exchange his own single bane is the absolute worst one he could have. Sure, being stuck in Wyvern Lord for a while isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's never a good thing to need to grind out a skill in a single class for an extended length of time. Like Lauren's, Ignatz deserves to be up there with the other guys with only a single bane at the upper end of B tier, a B+ tier, if you will. But where to put him is another matter. He's clearly not on the same level as Felix, and based on the relative damage caused by each of their banes, I wouldn't put him over Sylvain either. Ignatz fares better compared to Ash though, as he's got a higher net proficiency and also matches Ash's strongest boon. Right above Ash is a good place for him, I think. Now here's a fun one for you. A quick look at Lysithia's skill ranks isn't too promising. She's basically Dorothea with an authority boon and a worse set of banes. But, of course, anyone who's played this game or even just seen some of its memes can tell you that Lysithia's strengths lie elsewhere, in the form of the highest magic growth in the game, a ton of strong offensive spells, Warp, and most importantly for 100%, the personal ability Mastermind, which doubles her rate of class and skill experience gained in combat. Well, it's not exactly doubled, the math is a little more complicated when it comes to skill. But even so, there's no denying that Lysithia's growth will quickly outstrip that of every other character. I even recommend that your first playthrough for 100% purposes, the one you have to do in New Game before you can unlock New Game Plus, be done in Verdant Wind, so you can take advantage of Lysithia's speedy growth even before your units can start taking advantage of Saint statue bonuses. Her skills will increase so rapidly that her banes aren't much of a hindrance to her, not even that annoying heavy armor bane, and her weak physical performance will barely matter when she'll max out authority in her first active run and can be used as an adjutant from then on. Lysithia has to go in A tier, even above the characters with no banes, because no one else can match her performance without trading around one of the knowledge gems, and the first of those isn't available until Chapter 8, meaning Lysithia will outpace everyone for at least the first third of each run. And even then, she won't need to compete for one of the gems to speed up her growth like everyone else later on. She truly is a prodigy. Kind of weird that Mastermind doesn't increase her skill growth in the classroom, but I suppose at some point the designers figured she was already overpowered enough. On the more balanced side of things, here's Marianne. Marianne comes with an impressive 4 boons, plus a budding talent spanning both physical and magical options, and she can back them up with strong spell list and 2 good magic combat arts in Soul Blade and Frozen Lance to help her work around her low strength growth. Sadly for her though, all those boons come paired with 2 bottom tier banes, leaving her with 4 classes that will just drag on for her in the long grind to S+. So while she's got the same high net proficiency as Felix, Sylvain, and Ignatz, her banes will hold her back quite a bit compared to them. I'm thinking she belongs just above Annette, whose Bane and Bows is only slightly less of an issue than Marianne's Bane and Brawling, but who also has fewer strong points. Coming in below Petra fits Marianne well too, as Petra also has 2 difficult Banes, although she's nowhere near as limited in class options for them. As I said way back in part 1, Banes do often count for more than boons. Hilda is an anomaly, but not one who stands out just by looking at her skill ranks. No, what's odd about her is her availability. She can be recruited out of house like normal for the Lions, but for the Eagles she's unavailable unless you side against Edelgard, in which case your only chance to recruit her will be in Chapter 12. From a character standpoint, I can applaud Hilda as the only really interesting application of cross-house recruitment, as it implies that she's smart enough not to follow Edelgard, but also not so attached to Claude that she's unable to see herself anywhere but at his side. With that said, though, that weird availability isn't doing Hilda any favors as a unit, and in fact, she's going to be the first character in C tier because of it. Her budding talent in heavy armor and her randomly learning bolting aren't enough to make up for the classroom time she'll be missing out on in your Eagles runs. Moreover, the less availability a character has, the more an authority Bane like Hilda stings. But put a pin in that thought, because we're going to come back to it in a big way in part 3. Fortunately, the Deer finish up with more of their A-tier material. Leonie's boons are the same as Bernadetta's, only she's got no Banes to hold her back, and so fares far better when she's going for classes outside the path to Bow Knight. Having only 3 boons is a little underwhelming compared to Ferdinand and Ingrid, and additionally, Leonie's hybrid prospects are noticeably worse than Ingrid's with her lower magic growth, but a lack of Banes is still a valuable asset. She does learn point-blank volley, which while not crucial for doubling the way it is in Maddening, can be a useful positioning tool as most bows can't be used at one range on player phase. That's pretty much all I can find to say about Leonie. Nothing very exciting, but all the same she'll have a smooth time getting all maxed out just like the other A tiers. Alright, that'll do it for the student characters. Be sure to like the video and subscribe if you've been enjoying this tier list, so that way you can be notified when the 3rd and final part comes out. In that one, I'll be tackling all the remaining characters, both in the base game and in its DLC, and let me just say that group's all over the place in terms of performance and tier placement. Au revoir!